The sun was just beginning to rise over the skyline of Boston as thousands of runners gathered at the starting line of the annual marathon. The air was crisp with anticipation, a perfect spring morning that promised ideal conditions for the 26.2-mile journey ahead. Among the sea of colorful running gear and nervous smiles stood Marcus Chun, a 34-year-old high school track coach who had been training for this moment for the past year. This wasn't just any race for Marcus. It was his fifth attempt at qualifying for the prestigious national championships, a dream that had eluded him by mere minutes in his previous attempts. But there was something else weighing on Marcus's mind that morning, or rather, someone else. Daniel Rodriguez, the man who had become his unintentional rival over the past 3 years. Daniel stood just a few yards away, his tall frame easy to spot, even in the crowd. He was stretching his hamstrings with the calm confidence of someone who had conquered this course before, which he had 3 times now. Each time Marcus had entered a marathon where Daniel was running, Daniel had finished ahead of him. Not by much, sometimes just by seconds, but always ahead. Their rivalry wasn't something they had ever openly acknowledged to each other. In fact, they had barely exchanged more than polite nods at race expos and water stations. But Marcus felt it deeply, this constant measuring of himself against the more accomplished runner. Let me take you back to how this all began. Marcus hadn't always been a runner. Growing up with asthma, he'd avoided sports that required sustained cardiovascular effort. But in his late 20s, after a difficult divorce left him searching for something to rebuild his sense of self, he found running. It started with short jogs around his neighborhood, gasping for breath after just half a mile. But there was something about the rhythm of his feet hitting the pavement that spoke to him, that offered a meditative space where his anxious thoughts couldn't follow. Gradually, those half-mile runs extended to 1 mile, then 3, then 10. By his 31st birthday, Marcus had completed his first marathon, finishing in just under 4 hours, not competitive by elite standards, but a personal victory he cherished. Daniel's story was quite different. A former college track star who had narrowly missed qualifying for the Olympic trials in his younger days, he had taken a break from competitive running to build his physical therapy practice. When he returned to the marathon scene 5 years ago, he did so with the efficient grace of someone born to run. His first marathon back, he finished in 2 hours and 45 minutes, a time that most recreational runners could only dream of. It was at that same marathon that Marcus first noticed him, not just because of his impressive time, but because of the way he ran, with a kind of joyful intensity that made the grueling effort look almost effortless. The rivalry, if you could call it that, developed organically over subsequent races. They often found themselves registered for the same events, their paths crossing at major marathons across the country. Marcus would spot Daniel's name on the results list, always a dozen or so places ahead of his own. As Marcus improved his own times, shaving off minutes with each training cycle, the gap between them narrowed. But never enough for Marcus to pull ahead. Daniel became a measuring stick, an unwitting motivation that pushed Marcus to train harder, to dig deeper, to believe he could be better. What makes running unique among sports is the peculiar blend of competition and camaraderie it fosters. Unlike team sports where opponents are clearly defined, in a marathon, your greatest competitor is often yourself, your own limitations, your own doubts. Yet there's also this beautiful community aspect, thousands of individuals pursuing personal goals while collectively sharing in the experience. This duality was something Marcus had come to appreciate, even as he nursed his private competition with Daniel. The atmosphere of the Boston Marathon amplified these feelings tenfold. The historic course, lined with spectators cheering for strangers as if they were family, created an electric energy that was almost overwhelming. As Marcus stood at the starting line, he could feel the collective anticipation of nearly 30,000 runners, each with their own story, their own reason for being there. Some were chasing qualifying times for other races, others fulfilling lifelong dreams, and many running for causes greater than themselves. Charity bibs honoring loved ones or supporting research for diseases that had touched their lives. The months leading up to this day had been intense for Marcus. He had restructured his entire training regimen, working with a coach for the first time, incorporating strength training and nutrition plans that were new to him. He'd woken up at 4:30 a.m. for long runs before work, logged miles during lunch breaks, and sacrificed social events for recovery time. all with one goal in mind: to qualify for nationals, which meant he needed to finish in under 2 hours and 50 minutes. And yes, if he was being honest with himself, to finally finish ahead of Daniel Rodriguez. What Marcus didn't know was that Daniel had been aware of him too. In the running community, especially among those who consistently place in the top percentiles of their age groups, you start to recognize the same names, the same faces. Daniel had noticed how Marcus's times had improved race after race, how the gap between them had shrunk from minutes to seconds. He respected the dedication that kind of improvement required. In fact, at the pre-race expo the day before, when they had passed each other at a nutrition supplement booth, Daniel had actually stopped and said, "Hey, you're Marcus Chun, right? Great job at Chicago last fall. You're getting faster every race." The brief interaction had left Marcus simultaneously flattered and more determined than ever. The starting gun fired, and the mass of runners surged forward like a colorful wave. The first few miles of any marathon are deceptive. Adrenaline makes the pace feel easy. The body hasn't yet begun to protest, and the finish line exists as a distant concept rather than an immediate goal. Marcus settled into his target pace, careful not to get swept up in the excitement and go out too fast, a rookie mistake he'd made in his earlier marathons. He had a race plan: maintain a 6:30 per mile pace for the first half, then assess how he felt before potentially picking up the pace. Around mile 4, Marcus spotted Daniel about 20 yards ahead, his distinctive red and black singlet visible in the crowd. He was running smoothly, seemingly without effort, chatting occasionally with runners around him. Marcus felt a familiar twinge of both admiration and competitiveness. Should he try to catch up now? No, he decided, stick to the plan. There were still more than 22 miles to go, plenty of time for the race to unfold. The course wound through charming neighborhoods, past landmarks that Marcus had studied on the course map, but that now came alive with context and character. Spectators lined the streets, holding signs, offering orange slices, playing music. Children extended their hands for high fives, and Marcus obliged whenever he could, drawing energy from their enthusiasm. This was one of the aspects of marathons he loved most: the way communities transformed their streets into corridors of support for complete strangers. By mile 10, Marcus was feeling strong, right on pace, and had managed to close some of the distance between himself and Daniel. They were now approaching the famous Scream Tunnel at Wellesley College, where students lined the course offering cheers, and sometimes kisses, to passing runners. The wall of sound was disorienting but exhilarating, and Marcus found himself smiling despite the growing fatigue in his legs. It was just past the halfway point, after they'd conquered the first of the 4 notorious Newton Hills, that Marcus finally pulled even with Daniel. For a quarter mile, they ran side by side without acknowledging each other, both focused on the road ahead, both aware of the other's presence. Finally, Daniel glanced over and gave a small nod of recognition. "Nice pace," he said between controlled breaths. "You're looking strong today." The simple compliment shouldn't have meant as much as it did, but coming from someone Marcus had silently competed against for years, it felt significant. "Thanks," Marcus replied. "You too. As always." They exchanged brief smiles before returning their focus to the road, but something had shifted. The rivalry felt less adversarial now, more like a mutual pushing toward excellence. As they approached the infamous Heartbreak Hill around mile 20, the true character of the marathon began to reveal itself. This is where the race truly begins, veterans often say. The body has burned through its glycogen stores, muscles start to rebel, and the mind begins to question every life decision that led to this moment of voluntary suffering. Marcus had prepared for this, both physically and mentally. He had visualized this exact point in the race during his training runs, rehearsed the mantras he would use to push through the pain. What he hadn't prepared for was seeing Daniel struggle. As they began the ascent up Heartbreak Hill, Marcus noticed Daniel's smooth stride had become slightly labored. His breathing was more audible, his form showing subtle signs of fatigue. For a brief moment, Marcus felt a surge of competitive satisfaction. This was his chance to finally pull ahead, to reverse their usual finishing order. But then he noticed something else. Daniel was occasionally reaching for his left hamstring, wincing slightly with certain steps. The next few moments would later play over and over in Marcus's mind. He could have pushed ahead, taken advantage of his rival's physical distress. That had been the plan, hadn't it? To finally beat Daniel, to prove something to himself. Instead, as they crested the hill together, Marcus found himself asking, "Hey, you okay? Hamstring giving you trouble?" Daniel grimaced. "Old injury flaring up. I'll manage." His voice was tight with pain, his usual fluid stride now punctuated with subtle hitches. "Want some salt tabs? I've got extras." Marcus reached into the small pocket of his running shorts. Daniel looked surprised but accepted the electrolyte tablets gratefully. "Thanks, man. Didn't expect to need these today." As they continued down the other side of Heartbreak Hill, something unexpected happened. Instead of pulling ahead, Marcus found himself adjusting his pace to stay alongside Daniel. He couldn't quite explain why, even to himself. Perhaps it was respect for a fellow runner. Perhaps it was the realization that beating someone at their weakest wouldn't provide the satisfaction he had imagined. Or perhaps it was something deeper, a recognition that this rivalry had actually been a partnership all along, two strangers pushing each other toward their best selves without ever having spoken about it. The miles between 21 and 25 were a blur of pain and determination for both runners. They didn't speak much, conserving energy for the final push, but they remained side by side. When Daniel's hamstring spasm worsened around mile 23, causing him to momentarily break stride, Marcus instinctively placed a steadying hand on his elbow. "Easy," he said. "We've got this. Just a 5K left." Daniel nodded gratefully, and they pressed on. What's fascinating about moments of physical duress is how they strip away pretenses, revealing character in its rawest form. Here were two men who had silently competed for years, now finding strength in mutual support. As they made the famous right turn onto Hereford Street, then left onto Boylston, the finish line came into view in the distance. The roar of the crowd was deafening, a wall of sound that seemed to physically push them forward. Marcus glanced at his watch. They were going to make it, both of them, under the qualifying time for nationals. His goal was within reach. He could feel the emotion building in his chest, the culmination of thousands of training miles, early mornings, and sacrifices. He looked over at Daniel, saw the same recognition in his eyes, the same mix of pain and imminent triumph. Without a word, Daniel extended his hand. Marcus hesitated only for a fraction of a second before grasping it firmly. Together, they accelerated for the final stretch, their joined hands raised slightly between them. The crowd, noticing this unexpected display of solidarity, roared even louder. Photographers along the finish straightaway captured the moment. Two competitors, hands clasped in mutual respect, faces showing the beautiful agony of marathon finishing kicks. They crossed the finish line together, the clock showing 2 hours, 47 minutes, and 33 seconds. Both had qualified for nationals. Both had achieved their goals. As they bent over, hands on knees, gulping air into oxygen-starved lungs, Marcus felt a hand on his shoulder. "Thanks," Daniel said simply. "I wouldn't have made it under qualifying time without you." Marcus shook his head. "I've been chasing you for 3 years. You've pushed me to be better without even knowing it." They made their way through the finish area together, collecting medals, space blankets, and recovery food. What struck Marcus most was how natural it felt, conversing with this person who had been a significant figure in his running journey, yet a complete stranger until today. They exchanged phone numbers before separating to find their respective friends and family who had come to support them. The aftermath of the race brought a flurry of emotions and reactions. When Marcus's students and fellow coaches saw the finish line photo, which had already begun circulating on running social media accounts, they bombarded him with questions. What happened? Did you know him? Was it planned? Marcus struggled to articulate exactly what had transpired, how a rivalry had transformed into something else entirely in the crucible of those final miles. In the days that followed, as Marcus's body recovered from the marathon's demands, he and Daniel texted regularly. They discovered they lived only about an hour apart, Daniel in the suburbs north of the city, Marcus to the west. They made plans to meet for a recovery run the following weekend. "Super slow, I promise," Daniel had written. "My hamstring needs at least a week." That first run together was awkward initially, both men trying to reconcile the new reality of friendship with years of silent competition. But as the miles accumulated beneath their feet, conversation flowed more easily. They talked about their running histories, their goals beyond nationals, their lives outside of running. Daniel spoke about his physical therapy practice, how he specialized in helping injured runners return to the sport they loved. Marcus shared stories about his high school track team, the fulfillment he found in mentoring young athletes. What emerged most clearly was how similar their approaches to running were, despite their different backgrounds. Both saw the sport as a way to continually redefine their limitations, to discover new reservoirs of strength within themselves. Both valued the process as much as the outcomes, the daily discipline of training as much as the occasional glory of race day achievements. Over the following months, as they both prepared for the national championships, they began training together once a week. These sessions became highlights for Marcus, opportunities to learn from Daniel's experience and to push himself in ways solo training couldn't provide. Daniel, too, seemed to benefit from the arrangement, finding renewed motivation in Marcus's determination and fresh perspective. The story of their Boston Marathon finish had taken on a life of its own within the running community. A sports photographer's image of them crossing the line hand in hand had been featured in Runner's World magazine, accompanying an article about sportsmanship and the unique culture of marathon running. They had even been invited to speak at a few local running clubs about their experience, an opportunity that both amused and slightly embarrassed them. "We're not exactly experts on friendship," Daniel had joked during one such talk. "We spent 3 years avoiding actual conversation." But that was the beauty of what had happened, Marcus realized. In a world that often emphasized winning at all costs, their spontaneous moment of connection reminded people that competition and compassion weren't mutually exclusive. That sometimes, the most meaningful victories weren't about who finished first, but about who we became along the way and who we brought alongside us. When nationals finally arrived 6 months later, they approached the race differently than they had any previous competition. They didn't plan to run the entire race together. They had different strengths and race strategies, but they wished each other luck at the starting line without the undercurrent of rivalry that had once defined their relationship. Marcus ended up finishing 2 minutes ahead of Daniel that day, setting a new personal record in the process. When Daniel crossed the finish line, Marcus was waiting, ready with a high five and genuine congratulations. There was no jealousy, no comparison, just appreciation for what each had accomplished. As they sat recovering afterward, Daniel asked a question that had apparently been on his mind. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd actually talked to each other years ago, at that first race where we both competed?" Marcus considered this. "I think everything happened exactly when it needed to. I wasn't ready for friendship then. I needed the competition. I needed someone to chase." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "And now? Now I'd rather run with you than against you," Marcus said simply. "Turns out it's a lot more fun having a partner than a rival." The transformation from rivalry to friendship taught Marcus something profound about competition itself. At its best, competition wasn't about defeating others, but about bringing out the best in each other. The word compete comes from the Latin competire, which originally meant to strive together. That's what he and Daniel had been doing all along. He realized, striving together, pushing each other toward excellence, even before they acknowledged each other's existence. In the years that followed, Marcus and Daniel became not just training partners, but close friends. They started a coaching program together, combining Daniel's physical therapy expertise with Marcus's experience mentoring young athletes. They ran more marathons, sometimes racing for time, sometimes pacing each other, sometimes just enjoying the journey side by side. And every year, they returned to Boston, to the marathon that had transformed their rivalry into something much more meaningful. They never again finished hand in hand. That moment had been singular, spontaneous, impossible to recreate. But they always found each other after crossing the finish line, regardless of their individual times, to celebrate what the day represented. Not just the culmination of months of training, but the anniversary of a connection that had made both their running lives and their everyday lives richer. What Marcus had once viewed as a rivalry, something that could only end with one victor and one defeated, had become one of the most valuable relationships in his life. It was a reminder that sometimes our competitors can become our greatest allies, that the people who challenge us most directly can also be the ones who help us grow most significantly, and that occasionally, the most meaningful finish lines are the ones we cross not alone in triumph, but together in mutual respect, hands clasped in recognition of the journey shared. The story of Marcus and Daniel serves as a powerful reminder that in running, as in life, we rise higher when we lift each other up. That true victory isn't always measured by who finishes first, but by who we become along the way and who we bring alongside us on the journey. Sometimes, the greatest act of strength isn't pulling ahead, but reaching out a hand to someone else. And sometimes, the most meaningful competitions aren't the ones that end with a winner and a loser, but with two people who have helped each other become better than they could have been alone. Total _char_count, 18,791.